Welcome to End of Life University on YouTube. Today I'm sharing with you a fascinating conversation with Moon Zlotnick. She is an astrologer who has begun preparing death charts for people after they die as a way of helping the bereaved with their grief process. Wow, this was kind of a mind-blowing conversation with me. So interesting. And so I think that you'll really enjoy this. Take a few notes if you need to, and make a note of her books in case you'd like to read more. So also make sure you've subscribed to this channel using the button down below, and subscribe and leave a rating and review for the podcast wherever you happen to listen. That's really, really helpful to me. Go to eoluniversity.com/support if you're able to make a small contribution that will help keep this channel and the podcast on the air. So let's get into that interview with Moon Zlotnick, and I'll be back afterwards to say goodbye. Today, I'm very excited to welcome my special guest, Moon Zlotnick. Moon began her astrological studies in 1975 after having a profound spiritual experience. She has been practicing astrology full-time since 1978 and teaching astrology since 1981. She is psychologically and spiritually oriented and practices modern astrology. Moon is the author of the book Star Sisters, an astrologer's memoir of twin loss, and is currently working on her second book, Death Charts, using astrology to counsel the bereaved. And this is going to be such an interesting topic, and I'm really excited to talk with Moon about it. You can learn more about her work at her website, astrologybymoonrabbit.com. So, Moon, thank you for joining me today and welcome.
Definitely my pleasure.
Sorry about this. Mucus
Always
signal.
an inconvenient time, right?
Always, yeah. So I I thought maybe we should start just for anyone out there who isn't totally certain about what an astrologer does, if you want to talk about what your work consists of.
Um, so I see astrology as another healing tool, although it has many, many branches. Some people use to plan events, but it's basically using the date, place, and time for somebody's birth. And that creates like this cosmic narrative of who the person is. And it can be used to understand cycles. It can be used to understand relationships between people. There are medical astrologers, there are weather astrologers, there are astrologers in the financial world. There are many different types of astrology, but it all focuses on that date, place, and time, and this kind of birth potential that gets set in motion.
Hmm. I find it so fascinating, and I don't know very much about it. I mainly know my zodiac sign and, read a horoscope every now and then, but it all makes sense to me. I've had people in the past say, well, you're a scientist. You couldn't possibly believe in astrology. That's just magic. But, even as a scientist and a spiritual person, I see myself as connected to the universe, to the planets and the stars.
Yes,
And if I
yes,
am, then how much more interesting information is it to understand what was happening in the universe or in our galaxy at the
yes.
moment and time when I was born. So that I'm very fascinated by that idea.
And most people who don't believe in astrology maybe have never noticed how things happen on the full moon, like more visits to the ER or more babies being born than other times. I mean, we're living on a planet that responds to these larger universal and cosmic vibrations. And so why cut ourselves off from that?
Well, and we all experience gravity every single day, which is a planetary force here on our
There you
on our
go.
planet Earth. We have to be able to acknowledge there's more than just what's tangible to us in the moment. Well, I was really fascinated by the idea that you create death charts as well as birth charts. And I'm curious to know what drew you in this direction toward death charts and then also working with people who are bereaved.
So, I never actually intentionally set out to study this, but in 2005, my identical twin was diagnosed with stage 4 ovarian cancer. And she only lived 5 months after that. And I will say that there was something coming. I saw something coming in my chart about separation from a primary person, but I had no idea that it would be her, you know. Anyway, when she died, I was fortunate to be with her. And I looked at the time on the clock, and some months later, I decided I would just try and understand what was happening in that heavenly picture about why my twin had to leave at that time and what it meant for me in terms of surviving the loss. And I always say, I think most people understand that identical twins have a very unique bond. And it was very obvious when my twin was alive because we could start and finish each other's sentences and big life events would happen around the same time. But when she left, there was like this energy. I can't really explain it, but something physically within me and in my life was gone that I couldn't experience. I had never experienced that kind of disconnect. So it was a very, very profound loss, and then a very equally profound kind of recovery. And for me, this piece of astrology helped me enormously.
So it sounds like it may have just given you a different perspective or more or different information about what was happening at the moment that she died.
And those of us who are astrologers, we're used to cycles and we're used to kind of people coming to us when we're in crises. And I'm beginning to understand that, especially since COVID and the enormous losses that everyone experienced, that astrology actually has something to offer people who are maybe not in the early stages of grief, but who are moving through the trying to make sense of why this happened from a
Mm.
cosmic perspective.
Mm. That's very interesting. And I would say too, as someone who's worked in hospice for a number of years, one of the mysteries always around the end of life is the time of death because we don't understand it and we honestly can't predict it
Yeah.
medically. Because some people live far longer than we think they will live based on their medical condition. Some people die more quickly, and it's clear in hospice, even when we try to give the family a time frame for how long their loved one might live, oftentimes we're incorrect because we simply can't make a prediction just based on physical factors. And so it's always been clear to me there are other things at play here. There are other things going on that we don't see, that we don't understand. And there's some perfection about the timing of a person's death that is a little bit beyond us, that
Yeah.
we wish we fully understood it, but with what we see with our eyes, we
Yes.
can't fully grasp that. I just became aware something is there. There's something else going on. So that's what makes me really intrigued about your perspective and understand astrologically what might be happening in the world at that particular moment.
Mhm.
Not the
Yeah.
world, the universe, I guess.
Yes. Or kind of on a spiritual or cosmic level. So
Yes.
that is, in some ways, I think, for working with people who are grieving, that's a place where there can be some solace, because I see so often that there is an important sense of timing to when the person passes. And I don't do it like I haven't done anything for like the whole family, but for the person who has called me up and is interested in trying to understand why did this happen now? Yes, there are some things that speak to that. Okay, so
Yeah. I wanted to just go back a little bit to the fact that it was your identical twin
yeah,
sister that died, and so that intrigues me because you're born a few minutes, I suppose, apart from
yeah,
each other. So you
yeah,
have different birth charts because
right,
of that. You're identical twins genetically, but a different birth
yes,
chart, and that's
right.
really fascinating. And you know, and you're unique individuals, and so, but I can imagine how given that your the time of your birth was so closely aligned that it would be comforting to you to be able to understand as much as you could about about the moment of her death.
And after she died, I found a group, Twinless Twins International. So uh, I went to a conference that they were having, and I realized that because you're born together, twins have this unique idea that you'll die together.
Mm.
So like couples who've been married forever, you hear stories about they died 2 days apart or they died 2 weeks apart. And I always felt like with my sister that we would be all together, and we would have all this exact timing like we'd experienced so much of in our lives. So the idea, and other people echoed this at that Twinless Twin conference, the idea of being alone for so many years without them, it was just unthinkable. And so there's this extra level, I think, for twins, especially in most twins, there's a dynamic.
Hmm.
There's the A twin and the B twin. And my twin was the A twin, right? And so, of course, she was going to be always the stronger one. So a lot of twins talked about that I should have been the one because I was sickly as a child or whatever. So there's so many things to grapple with on on that level.
Oh, that's so very interesting. And so your first book, Star Sisters and Astrologers, Memoir of Twin Loss, details all of this, I'm sure. And
Yes,
even maybe what you learned by doing your
yes,
sister's death chart.
yes,
Hmm.
yes,
Wow. It's really fascinating. And it brings up so many questions in my own mind. When I think about my close loved ones, my parents primarily, who died, and just wondering what their
mhm,
death chart might have
yeah.
looked like. But tell me a little bit, say, if I were going to work with you to ask for a death chart, what kind of information would you need from me for that?
So if somebody wants to work with me, I need their date, time, and place of birth. And um, it's been a law since the 1900s almost that every state have a record of time of birth for people. This is a very common question. So if you call the Department of Vital Statistics for the county seat that you were born, usually you can get a time of birth over the phone. And then the next thing was, which is much, much more complicated, is the date, time, and place of the death. And sometimes, like when people die in care settings, it isn't exact, or if people are killed in an accident, it isn't exact. So the time of death, it's wonderful when we have it. And there's a few things I've developed to work with when it's a little bit like between this and that time. Okay, so those are the two things, and that's where I start.
And so, for you, how do you proceed from there when you're making a chart? What, how does that work?
So here's the thinking that I've developed that I'm writing my next book about is astrologers believe in something called the natal promise. So within every birth chart, I said there's kind of a narrative about the whole entire life story. And I'll use myself as an example. So both my twin and I were born with a symbol for the moon right next to the planet Pluto, which is a literal symbol of death. And when we were 17, when we were 16, our mom got diagnosed with cancer and died when we were 17. So that early kind of, I suppose you could call it life trauma, which it was there in the birth chart, but it didn't go away. So the event happened, and I didn't really think, oh, could this possibly repeat? But the moon, which is the symbol for the mom, is the symbol for the family.
Mm.
And so here again, there's an activation, and then my sister gets cancer. So I would say that probably between 80 and 90% of all the charts I've done, there was something very specific in the birth chart that not forecasted, because I would never tell somebody during a birth chart reading, you will encounter death at this time in life. But in retrospect, you can see, you know, some kind of a loss crisis, this kind of yeah, you can see it. Sometimes it shows up spouse, sometimes it shows up kids, sometimes it shows up parent. So you look at the birth chart, and then you have these two other, you have the death chart itself. That's the date, time, and place that somebody passed over. And that has its own narrative. And it talks about, I don't know how to describe it other than the energy of the passage. So, working in hospice, that some people seem to kind of move on with no resistance, and other people kind of have a harder time. And some people, the family is really accepting of what's going on, while other families, no, they're hanging on for dear life. So the death chart will have a picture for the death about the physical, mental, and spiritual ascension or crossing that happened. And I find this in particular to bring great comfort to people, because everybody is afraid that their loved one suffered. Everybody is afraid that the loved one is lost or they don't know where they are. I mean, we have so many fears about death because we can't control anything about it. So the death chart can kind of tell a different narrative about the passage, not where the soul goes afterwards or anything much beyond the last breath. Then there's a third part that talks about the individual, why this is happening in their lives at this time. And kind of not in a negative way, like you have a lesson to learn, but kind of what transformation is possible. So we know, because we've experienced deep losses, that they leave you changed. You aren't the same as when that person was alive. So there's a potential in that loss for something even positive to emerge. And that's what I like to help people with. So I'll give a little example again from my experience, because I can't talk about other people's, but there's a planet that takes 84 years astrologically to do anything once. So when it comes around, it's doing something important. And the planet that has to do with autonomy, independence, separateness, individuality, even before my twin got sick, it was activating both of the symbols for identity. Who are you? In both of our charts. So, the sky says you're going to have an identity crisis. You're coming into a period of time where you'll be forced to learn about independence and autonomy and individuality. Well, it's very hard to learn about individuality when you live in the same town as your identical twin.
Mhm.
And you go to the grocery store and people walk up to you and start talking to you and you've never met them. Or you're in the bank and people are talking to you and calling you by your twin's name. Like it's very hard to have an individual self because you're part of a duo. So, yes, did I learn about that? Yes. Did I also have to face that we were interdependent, but maybe a tiny bit codependent, you know? So that's kind of where I focus as an astrologer, that nobody would choose for this to happen. But sometimes there is this transformation that is powerful, even maybe positive.
Wow, I think that is really powerful, and I was thinking about the value of looking back in retrospect, because that's one thing I help people in hospice do all the time is looking back at life and looking at the narrative of life, how things have unfolded. And I see it as a big puzzle in a way, and how pieces fit together that you never understood why this thing happened, but it fit with another piece of something that came later in life. And so again, it seems like the death chart helps provide more pieces of the puzzle and helps us fill out that picture even more for an individual, but then also as the bereaved person to even
Mhm.
understand a role we might have played, or how this person's death is interacting with us, with our lifetime, and as you said, asking us to change or giving us an opportunity to change.
Yes. And I think astrology as a whole is useful for those puzzle pieces and making sense of them. Because, I've heard stories from people, I'm sure you have too. And this is not so much about death, but I mean, I'm thinking of somebody who got married really young and kind of went into it in a naive way. And as time passed, realized that the person was abusive in some way. And so they got a divorce, but didn't do any introspection, got remarried, and the next person was just as abusive. So, there are these kind of innate patterns, potentials that we can change, but it takes consciousness to do that.
Mhm.
And that's what astrology can bring. It can bring this outside perspective.
Mm. Yeah, so very true. And I wanted to ask you, I know some people who have had readings have come away from them feeling frightened because they might have heard something that seemed threatening to them, or as you said, perhaps someone tried to predict the future and it ended up inducing fear. So how do you avoid creating fear in people that you do charts for?
It's such a wonderful question. Um, so I tell people that everything we're talking about is potential, and that almost everything when I'm talking about the future, uh, I carefully use language that keeps it in it might be, it may be, this is what I've seen for other people, like in that more abstract realm. And, one of the things that most professional astrologers would agree on is the do no harm maxim. So people who are well trained and well versed and well disciplined in astrology usually have gone through some kind of training to work with people in a way that's very, very empowering and affirming. And so much of that has to do with language. And I will often share something, and then people will say what the fear is. So they'll be afraid of something. Do you mean I'm going to lose my job? And I'm like, no, I can't see that. Do you know what I mean? And
Mhm.
so, yeah.
So I love the idea that you're showing them or talking to them about possibilities, not certainties. It's not a prediction or a foretelling. It's just showing possibilities on the whole spectrum of what could happen in life.
And like I said, when I saw this event, this astrological event coming, I thought, oh, okay, there's going to be some kind of upheaval with an important person that's going to impact my identity. But I had no idea what actually was in my future until my twin called me from the hospital.
Mm. Yeah. So you saw the potential for it and the possibility, but it didn't have specific details
Yes,
of where, when, how,
right.
who would be part of that. So that's really fascinating. I'm curious to know if you have a case study you could share with us where a
Yes,
death chart reading provided some insights.
I'd love to. Um, so this was a situation where a woman called me. Uh, She had divorced her husband of 30 years. He didn't want the divorce. She really was unhappy. She insisted. And then 2 months later, he committed suicide.
Mm,
And she felt like she was the cause. So I asked her for her husband's date of birth so I could do a birth chart on him. And in his birth chart, there was a trigger around something in his relationship with his father that had never been resolved. So I asked her if she knew anything about his family, and they grew up together in this small town. So they knew each other's family really, really well. So then I said to her, well, there was something going on inside of him about his relationship with his dad that he'd never resolved. And she was like stunned because that had been a bone of contention in their relationship, that
mm,
he had all this trauma that he hadn't worked on. And so it was clear to me, and she accepted it, that that was the reason, and that the divorce wasn't perfect, but it really, she was not the cause of
mm,
his suicide.
mm.
So I have another example. I don't know if you want another one, but
Yes, definitely. It's really fascinating.
yeah, it's fascinating to me too, kind of like to look to do this investigation to what might provide some um, cosmic perspective for the person. So this was another woman in her early 40s, and uh, her younger brother had rheumatic fever growing up, and they knew kind of he had some heart issues as an adult, and he was kind of having some health problems, but he had them from his family. They were living far away from each other. And he was finally scheduled for surgery and he died 2 days before.
Mm,
And the sister felt like it was, of course, her fault for not insisting that he go to the doctor or go to the hospital sooner. So he had actively been downplaying it, which, of course, I reminded her. But I looked back. So now I'm going to get kind of technical, but there's something I use in astrology, and actually we're having one of them on October 2nd. It's a solar eclipse. It's not happening here, but they impact the energy a lot. So I
mm,
looked back to what was happening in his chart. It was like 4 or 5 months earlier. And it made this very, very strong suggestion that even if he had the surgery, he wouldn't have survived it.
mm.
So we'll never know. But that was kind of, I use intuition to some degree in some of this, but that was a point of clarity for me that even if he had lived for 2 days, it still was very, very touch and go.
Mm.
So, like, it's offering another perspective. That one wasn't as cut and dry, but it was helpful. I know it was helpful.
Yes, yes, I can see that. Well, whenever someone we love so dearly dies, it's normal for us to feel a sense of guilt somehow or start questioning, could I have done something else? What should I have done? What mistake might I have made that led to this? And so to be able to help with a bigger perspective than that so that we don't get lost in that kind of thinking that somehow I did something that caused this to happen and can see a much bigger picture. There are many different things at play, many different things happening at once. I think that alone is really comforting to people. And I know when after my dad's death by suicide, that's something I really needed to work on and to hear for years, a number of years, feeling somehow some vague sense of guilt that I should have prevented it. I should have fixed things. I should have
Mhm.
changed things.
Or
So,
even knowing that was happening,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
Yeah.
And so I can just see anything. And for me, even anyone who told me a story that had to do, an interaction with my dad or something that happened around the time of his death, that was very powerful to me just to hear from another person what they saw and how things looked. So I see why the death chart, it's another person's view of what's happening at that time. And it's just really fascinating. And so it sounds like the people who come for a death chart maybe already are comfortable with the idea of astrology, for the most part, or do you find some
It
that,
isn't, no, it isn't necessarily true. Like someone gave somebody else a death chart reading after the death of their daughter as a gift. She'd never been to an astrologer before, had no idea what astrology was, but this was somebody who'd been seeing me for quite a while and they were good friends, so she took a chance.
hmm, yeah, so so that's interesting. I mean, it's a value even for someone who may not have ever experienced anything like this before.
Mhm. I think just that the person needs to be open to kind of a more universal or a cosmic energy force in our lives.
Yes, yes, to that idea that there's a higher
More,
consciousness and
yes,
that,
right.
and you wrote that the insights from a death chart can help people live more consciously and purposefully. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about that, like how how do we? I know you've talked a little bit about in your own life and what a difference that made, but
Um, so when we move away from the angst and the guilt and the self-recrimination and the blame, and we are able to kind of understand. It's not that I want to say everything happens for a reason, because I don't think that's true, but that within every crisis, there is an opportunity for immense, enormous personal growth. And so the loss can become a source of strength for people. Even if it's, I survived this, now I can survive anything, which is kind of terrible. But people can discover within strength they didn't know they had. People can shift their worldview to encompass something more spiritual than they had before. There can be kind of an openness or seeking for answers that leads them to a different kind of consciousness or a worldview. I'll tell you one other story as an example of this. So, this was a man who was in his early 60s, and he and his wife got married in college or just after college, and they raised a couple kids, and she was like a therapist and he was a psychoanalyst or psychiatrist, but they were both in the helping professions. And uh, when they were in their early 50s, his wife's best friend needed a kidney and she was a perfect match. So she decided to donate her kidney, and something went wrong during the surgery
Mm,
and she had brain damage.
mm,
And so she came out of the surgery and she was alive, but something happened that they couldn't fix in her brain. So she literally became a different person.
mm,
So she couldn't work. Her friends wouldn't have anything to do with her. Her kids couldn't stand her. So he became the solo caretaker for the last 10 years of her life. And when I did the death chart for, when I just did the mechanics of it, there was the symbol for the spouse, and it was all by itself. And everything else in that chart was in a group that was as far away from him
mm,
as it could be. So I said to him, "You were all alone with this, weren't you?" And he was like stunned because it had been terrible for him to have the burden, you know, and the loneliness of it, but to see that it was in the stars, so to speak,
mm.
it was like, oh, I guess I have to accept that it was that way for a reason. Now, can I find a reason? So after his wife died, he started practicing Buddhist meditation. And I
Mm.
was talking to him a year afterwards, and he said that the Buddhist meditation had changed his life. So it wasn't the astrology reading, but it was the death. And then the compliment of, oh, you were all alone with this, weren't you? Okay. So,
Wow. Wow. And it set him off on a new path of discovery. And also, because I think sometimes the questions that we have about things that have happened in life and in death, they can become obstacles to our growth if we get stuck in the questions and we're trying to answer the question in this moment, and there may not be an answer for it, but it can keep us from growing if we insist that we have to figure that out. But when we can turn around and think this is what happened, so now how do I make something of it, what can I do, and not to say, again, not saying everything happens for a reason, so we have to find the reason, only that everything that happens, we can find a way that we can not only live with it, but we can continue to grow with that reality, because that's what life has given us. We can continue to grow and learn from it. And so I really love that example of how his entire life changed, and in a way maybe his loneliness was preparing him for a more spiritual, um, monastic type of life in a way as
mhm.
well. That's really interesting. Wow, I'm really seeing the power of death charts. On the one hand, it sounds interesting and fascinating, but I can also see that it could be pivotal for someone who's struggling with grief. I think of, even as for myself, as I said, because I struggled for so many
Yes.
years, that could have made a difference for me a long time ago, had I known about it or had that been available to me. And I'm just curious. I mean, I've never heard of it before. Are there very many other people who do death
Well,
charts?
I'm breaking some new ground here. So astrologers have like studied famous people's death, and looked at the charts. There are quite a few on YouTube, like Frida Kahlo or, different people. But nobody has seen the healing potential with using this for the people who are grieving. And so, because of my own journey and the difference that it made for me to have this unique tool that my life has been devoted to, it was like 30 So my twins have been dead almost 20 years, and I'd been an astrologer for almost 30 years. So
Mm,
I was already in this world so heavily. And to be searching for answers and then see these symbols put things into a perspective that I could have never gotten to on my own.
mm,
I thought, well, let's see if this works for other people. So, as far as I know, nobody else is doing this.
mm.
And
Wow.
I am just now, uh, so I'm working on completing a book and beginning to start teaching classes, but those would be for astrologers. So people have to know the trade.
So will the book, so it's death charts using astrology to counsel the bereaved, will that be primarily for astrologers to teach them? Or
Yes and no. So, I mean, the first few chapters are all about understanding loss and how to be with people who are grieving. And, so I don't know. People have said to me, because I said it's for astrologers, and other people said, no, no, don't limit yourself. And the stories are so interesting,
Mhm.
so I'm not sure yet.
Mm. Well, I was just going to ask you that I would imagine it takes some sort of special training to be able to read a death chart. So it sounds like that's the case, or at least you can help astrologers who would like to start doing it. You can give them
Yes.
some of the insights because you mentioned in your bio that you tend to be more psychologically and spiritually aware, and it seems like those are key
Mm,
components to this type of reading of a
right.
chart.
Right. Yes, and astrology probably maybe in the last 10 years has moved from, well, maybe it's 20 years, I don't know. But when I started, there was like no understanding of the interaction and the pacing and how what not to say and how to say certain things and how to make space for people to respond or to have feelings. Like this is relatively new in the astrology world. So astrologers would just dump a bunch of stuff on people and send them home, and that doesn't fly anymore. And we know too much about trauma and being trauma informed now, I think, to want to do that. So yes.
Yeah, which is probably the source of some of those stories that people have heard in the past and fears that some people have about astrology because they come from a time when there was less awareness of how to proceed and take into account a person's
Mhm.
psychological state and their orientation.
Yes.
Hmm. Yeah, so I can see this sounds really valuable that you'll be training other astrologers. And so how, if someone is interested in having a death chart prepared, how do they go about working with you? What's the
Okay.
process?
So astrologybymoonrabbit.com is where you can log in, and I have an automated system for setting up an appointment. And there's a series of questions. First, the actual data, but then, there's a good amount of space to talk about what it is you're hoping to find out about or how I can prepare to make the reading meaningful. And then pretty much doing Zoom meetings with people all over
Mm,
this country and even internationally. So pretty straightforward, I think.
mhm. How long does it take you to prepare a chart for someone?
Well, I would say we spend an hour together when we meet, and I've spent at least an hour in preparation before we meet.
So you get the information and you create the chart before you
Yes,
have the meeting so you
yes,
can present it
yes,
to them.
right. And
Oh,
everything's automated now. So I have a program. I even have an app for my phone. But we used to have to do everything by hand. So to create a chart used to take like at least an hour before even you could think about interpreting it. But now, no, everything's high tech.
yeah. That's really interesting. And so does the person come away from meeting with you with a like a transcript or something in writing that they
So
can
on
keep?
Zoom, you can do an audio recording and you can do an AI if you want, which that will capture the key points. So it's all based on what the Zoom system does. Most people are happy with audio files.
So that they, because I'm sure it's probably something people may want to refer back to over
Yes,
time, because
yes,
maybe some of the insights even are hard to grasp at first, and that people need time to reflect on it and sit and think,
yes.
and then go back to it over and over again.
And people often say that about the birth chart reading or that the comparison reading is when they went back and listened to it, they heard something that they missed completely the first time. So yes.
I think in a way, I think from the stories you've shared, you may have asked this, but I was wondering if more people tend to come for a death chart who've had a loved one die suddenly or unexpectedly than who've had a loved one die from, known causes over time when it's more expected, like in hospice. But I don't know if you have an answer.
Oh, I think the motivating factor is the guilt and the discomfort, the inability to kind of accept or move through what's happened. So, because I have people who, their parents were older and they were sick for a long time, and maybe that person never resolved something. So I think it's much more driven by emotions than immediacy.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. I'm also wondering, sometimes, we see families where there's a lot of conflict surrounding the death of a particular person with amongst the family members, sometimes over money or inheritance or past wounds. Would any of those types of issues possibly show up in the death chart as well?
In fact, they do. In fact, they do. So, right, like contentiousness within the family that will show up. Um, I had one other example that I'll bring up where uh, the wife's husband had a heart attack, but the reason that she called was as she was going through his computer and her adult children were helping her, she came across the fact that he'd been having an affair.
Hmm.
And that was in the death chart, not the affair, but the planet of illusion, deception, secrecy. So that was like in the stars that it was part of what she had to work through. So, yes, the circumstances in the environment, not super specifically, but in a bigger way will often show up.
Yeah. That's
And
so interesting. And
because it's a cycle, sometimes you can tell when things will get better. So if it's a contentious family, just for the person that you're doing the reading for, you can't do it for the whole family, at least I can't. But, if there's a resolution that's down the road away, sometimes you can see when that will happen.
And do positive things show up in the death chart as well? Things like, well, maybe you don't get asked to do death charts when there's a positive feeling, but I just remember at the timing of when my mother died, my mother had grown really close to her hospice nurse, and she died right after the hospice nurse arrived to check on her, but it felt that there was something perfect about it because the nurse somehow really needed to be there for her own. There was something to do with her
Okay.
needs. She needed to be there with my mom at the time of death. And that felt really clear to me at the moment that that's what my mom had been waiting for and the hospice nurse got held up by something, couldn't arrive as early as we thought she would, but something felt perfect about that. And I just was curious if something like that would show up.
Well, I mean, yeah, certainly everything kind of shows up. And like my twin had a wonderful death surrounded by people who loved her and were telling her, go home, go to the light, will be okay. And that showed up in the death chart.
Hmm.
It was a very, very elevated kind of energy in the room as she passed. And, that made it easier for me, of course, in some way that she got a great send off.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
Wow. And what a keepsake that would be as part of your memorial in a way. So at least for me, some of the that feeling that I had when my mom died of, as you said, the elevated energy in the room, it was so
mhm,
powerful. But weeks and months later down the road, it was harder to recall it. And I was just thinking to have something like the chart that would validate that really happened. That was real, and there was a reason for that. Wow, this is so interesting to me. I'm really grateful that you're willing to come on and just talk
it's
to me about
really,
it.
really my pleasure. I am hoping, to grow this work as much as I can and to find people who will grow it in the future and to build bridges with the deaf community in doing that because healing, I mean, people are searching after they have a loss, they are searching for anything that can help them. And it's excruciating. And so to provide some extra kind of service, that just really makes me happy.
Yes, so very true. Well, I don't know if it's in the stars, but it feels like our meeting and having this conversation and then being able to share it with listeners that there will be people out there who will hear this, either who this is what they're looking for themselves to have a death
Yes.
chart done, or people who are maybe they're astrologers themselves or looking for a new way to practice who um, maybe we just inspired some people who are
Yeah.
listening to our conversation. So well, I'm just so interested. I can't wait to read both of your books. I want to read more. And so oh, where can people find it? Your book that's available now is
Amazon.
Star
Yeah.
Sisters, and it's on
So right,
Amazon.
if you go Star Sisters and Astrologers, then it'll show up in Amazon because there are other books by the name of Star Sisters.
Okay.
Okay.
And by Moon Moon
Yeah.
Zlotnick.
Yes.
Moon
Exactly.
Zlotnick. Okay. Well, thank you so much, Moon, for joining me. It's been a pleasure to talk with you. And I have goosebumps.
Well, I love getting the word out, and thank you for inviting me.
Oh, you're very welcome. I hope you enjoyed that conversation as much as I did. Just fascinating. Never imagined that you could create an astrological chart around someone's date and time of death. And so I can't wait to learn more about that. And I hope you're interested in it as well. I'll be back again next week with another interview for you. And until then, take care. Bye bye.